The following program has been made possible by a media grant provided to area nonprofits by MCAT, Missoula Community Access Television, Missoula's community media resource.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Department of History, welcome to this year's Arnold Swanberg Lecture in Military History. I'd like to begin by thanking Arnold Swanberg for his generous support, which has made this series possible, and also to thank John Eglin, who's really put in a lot of work to take care of arrangements and pull off this year's event. I also would like to thank our speaker who abandoned the sweltering heat of Charlottesville to come join us in chilly Missoula. This year's lecturer is William Hitchcock. He's the William W. Corcoran Professor at the Department of History at the University of Virginia. He completed his BA in History and French at Kenyon College and then went on to do a PhD at Yale. He's taught at Yale, Wellesley College, Temple University, and since 2013 at the University of Virginia, where he was first Randolph-Compton Professor in the Miller Center and since 2018 has held the Corcoran Chair in the Department of History. Professor Hitchcock made his name initially as a historian of Europe. In 1998, he published France Restored, Cold War Diplomacy, and the Quest for Stability in Europe, 1945 to 54. His next book, The Struggle for Europe, The Turbulent History of a Divided Continent, 1945 to the Present, came out in 2003. It was published in England as well as in this country and translated into several other languages, including Italian and Hebrew. In 2008, he published The Bitter Road to Freedom, A New History of the Liberation of Europe, and it was a new history of the liberation of Europe. That book won the George Louis Beer Prize of the American Historical Association. It was translated into even more languages than the book that came out before. I would like to take just a minute to familiarize you with that book and recommend it to you. It surveys Europe from D-Day through the final battles of World War II and into the first few months after the end of the war. Historians, particularly in the West, have generally treated the liberation of Europe from Nazi rule as a military triumph, and it was. And Professor Hitchcock does not dispute this or try to diminish it in any way. But he also demonstrates that the process of liberation led to human tragedy of truly epic proportions. The path to liberation, he points out, was long and destructive and bloody. The book focuses on the devastating consequences of the fighting for civilian populations. It focuses on the attempts to provide relief to those who'd been affected by the fighting. And it pays attention to the impact of liberation, particularly on those freed from the camps and especially Europe's Jews. Relations between the liberators and the liberated were sometimes much more complicated than one might expect. Gratitude, certainly, but it might be mixed with resentment and new grievances. And for those liberated by Stalin's Soviet Union, one form of totalitarian tyranny replaced another. Professor Hitchcock's approach is to examine liberation from the ground up, as he puts it. If you read the book, you'll encounter stories of civilians from virtually all walks of life. And he tells his story based on a truly impressive array of primary sources from archives and memoirs and autobiographies and newspapers. But most recently, in 2018, Professor Hitchcock published The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s. That book builds on what's now decades of scholarship known as Eisenhower revisionism. Historians who've taken Eisenhower seriously rather than simply dismissing him as a bumbling grandfather. Professor Hitchcock offers a sympathetic but not uncritical view of the 34th president. And in the end, Professor Hitchcock concludes that Eisenhower was, quote, a model of loyalty, dignity, and decency, and that he lent his name to the age. Beyond that, Professor Hitchcock reminds us his people had lived in the presence of greatness. The title of his talk tonight is Eisenhower in Command, as you can see, how World War II shaped Ike's presidential leadership. And the poster that John Eglin put together for us, you see up there, I think speaks to that topic. It shows Eisenhower meeting with the 101st Airborne the night before D-Day. The plan for D-Day called for airborne units to drop behind German lines, and the Air Chief Marshal, Trafford Lee Mallory, who commanded the air on D-Day, who was always wrong, by the way, predicted that the 82nd and the 101st Airborne would lose 70% of their gliders and 50% of the paratroopers. With that knowledge in mind, on June 5th, the evening before D-Day, Eisenhower went out to visit the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st. He walked among the men, he shook hands with them, he looked them in the eye, he wished them well. It's hard to imagine the fortitude it took to meet with men whom he worried he was sending to their deaths. As it turned out, casualties were high, but not nearly what Lee Mallory had anticipated. They were about 20%. It's hard to imagine that such an experience wouldn't have shaped his approach to leadership and eventually influenced him in the White House. And that event indicates the rich vein of material that Professor Hitchcock has chosen to mine. And with that, I will stop and ask you to join me in welcoming Professor William Hitchcock.
Thank you so much, Mike. Appreciate it. Let me just get my slides rolling here. Okay. Well, thank you for coming out tonight. Can you hear me all right? Is this the right angle? It's lovely to be here. I have indeed come from record heat, not just warm weather in Virginia. They had record heat in Washington, D.C., and it's in the upper 90s, so I'm making sure to let my wife know how delightful and beautiful it is here. This is a gorgeous town. This is to an Easterner just a breathtaking place to spend a couple of days, and I'm very grateful to the History Department for the work that they've done in putting together this event. And it's a great honor to deliver the Swanberg Lecture in Military History. I just want to say, I think you will all agree, this is an important lecture series. Some of you will know, and if you don't, you'll be, I think, surprised to know that military history is not taught very much anymore in universities. There are various reasons for that. Perhaps it's seen a little bit as methodologically not as cutting edge as some other subjects, but the fact of the matter is that war has been at the heart of our nation's history from the very beginning of the country's formation. War has been a central driver of historical change, and we need to understand war in the past if we're to understand our country's present. Perhaps just as important, war continues to shape who we are today as a country, as a nation. We have armed forces, U.S. armed forces overseas in about 150 countries around the world. American soldiers are on active duty around the world. We spend $700 billion a year on the defense establishment, a very significant sum indeed, which shapes our national economy. Wars affect, of course, the soldiers who wage them. Wars affect the families of soldiers. Wars affect our own idea of who we are as a country in the world. So if we miss the opportunity to study the history of warfare, I think we're leaving out an enormous part of our own past and indeed our future. So I just want to wind up by saying thank you for inviting me to speak in this series, but also thank you for doing something I think universities need to do more of, which is study the impact of war upon society, politics, and history. I would also say, while I'm bad-mouthing the Academy, that another thing that the Academy has stopped doing is teaching presidential history. So I've written a book about a president, but we don't really study presidents as such in our history courses as much as we might have done 30 or 50 years ago. There's been a sea change, and I think probably for the best. But maybe the pendulum should swing back now to the center. After all, Are we not interested in the president today? Are we not interested in presidential politics and affairs? Every one of us is passionate about presidential activities. Why should we not want to study the history of our presidents? Most of us are fascinated by presidential history, but professional historians have gotten away from using the presidency as a framework to do contemporary history. So I'm delighted to give you a double dose of something that professional historians aren't supposed to do, both military history and presidential history, here tonight. I'm just thrilled that I get the chance to talk about the person of Dwight Eisenhower, both in his World War II role and as President of the United States. Let me reintroduce you, if you have not thought about Ike recently, to the biography of this quite extraordinary man. And I want to just say a few words about his biography because his biography was critical to his political success. His life story helped to make him who he was and who he became. Eisenhower was born in 1890 in Texas, but he grew up in the town of Abilene, Kansas. Being born in 1890 makes him the last president to have been born in the 19th century. Abilene in 1890, the 1890s, was a town of about 5,000 people. It was isolated in geographic terms, but it was connected to the rest of the country by a very substantial network of railways, which went through Abilene and carried mostly cattle from the southwest up to the large cities of the Midwest. So Eisenhower, I always feel that Eisenhower sort of knew where he was on the geography and the map of the country, even though he was in a tiny town in what appears to be in the middle of nowhere. The Eisenhower family grew to include 6 boys. So Eisenhower was one of 6 boys. They shared 2 bedrooms, so you can do the math. Eisenhower shared a bed with his brother Roy until he was a teenager. Eisenhower's father, David, worked long hours of manual labor in a dairy processing plant in Abilene, a creamery. They had absolutely no safety net of any kind. They lived very close to the margin, so much so that they supplemented their income by growing vegetables in the back garden, and Eisenhower periodically got out his little wagon and carried them up and down the streets of Abilene, selling them for a few pennies. So this is a family that knew poverty. As Eisenhower liked to say, this is the family household, and you can see it in Abilene, Kansas if you go and visit the Eisenhower Museum. Eisenhower liked to say later, and I think this is a key to his political genius, we were poor, but one of the glories of America at that time was that we didn't know it. He knew how to tell a story, and he knew how to place himself in the American story of literally rags to riches. Eisenhower was a popular boy in his hometown high school. He was a superb athlete. After graduation, he worked at the dairy alongside his father, but Eisenhower was a very ambitious young man, and he wanted to get up and out and see the world. He had a good friend, Swede Hazlitt, who had recently gotten into the Naval Academy, and Eisenhower was stunned to learn that he could get a college education for free by going into one of the service academies. And he said, great, maybe I'll try for the Naval Academy. Couldn't do it. They'd already taken their quota from his neighborhood, but he did apply to the U.S. Military Academy and was accepted. And in 1911, at age 20, off he went to West Point for a career in the Army. And I just want to stress this point because Eisenhower didn't go to West Point because he wanted to become a lifelong soldier. He went because he wanted a free college education. It was a ticket out of Abilene and to a world that he couldn't have imagined existed. But to think where he went from there is quite astonishing. After he left Abilene in 1911, he never went back to live in Abilene, but he always thought and said that Abilene was home. He of course, had his World War II museum built there after the war, but before he became president. And then he had his presidential library located in Abilene, and he and Mamie are buried there in Abilene. Long after he became a world-famous figure, he always said, the proudest thing I can claim is that I am from Abilene. So again, a real sensibility about how to tell his personal story. So he graduated from West Point in 1915, the famous class the stars fell on because so many general officers graduated in that class. He didn't get into combat in World War I, but he made his way up the ranks in the Army by getting noticed by powerful senior officers, influential mentors for him, generals like Fox Connor, John Blackjack Pershing, and the Army Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur. By being noticed and by working for these powerful figures, Eisenhower's star continued to rise. He gained a lot of extensive staff experience working in Washington, working on Capitol Hill, working for MacArthur especially. MacArthur in 1935 was went to the Philippines to build a new Philippine army, and he brought his best officer as his executive officer, Eisenhower, with him. So Eisenhower spent 4+ years in the Philippines working under MacArthur after having worked for him for 5 years in Washington. And it just so happens that MacArthur was one of his least favorite people on the planet. So he spent almost a decade of tutelage working really hard for a giant ego, learning something about what kind of general he did not want to be. But he still did the job. He still stuck it out. He was a professional through and through. When World War II broke out in Europe in September of 1939, Eisenhower was already, think about this, a 49-year-old lieutenant colonel. He was 49 years old. In a way, you know, he was over the hill. But imagine where he was going in just the next 5 years. He was in Manila. He begged MacArthur to let him go, come back to the States and get a command in the States, and he did. He used his connections to get a series of command jobs in back stateside. Days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, Eisenhower received orders from the new U.S. Army Chief of Staff, the redoubtable George C. Marshall, to come to Washington and take an assignment in the War Plans Division, there to assist Marshall in planning what was now going to be a great two-front global war against Germany and Japan. Here's Ike around 1942. Marshall recognized Eisenhower's talents as a staff officer, a superior organizer, and gave him larger and larger assignments, including going to London to run the European Theater of Operations. Eisenhower went to London in July 1942 to start building the great war machine that would wage the war against Hitler. He led the invasion of North Africa in 1942, then the invasion of Italy in 1943, before President Roosevelt gave him the biggest command of the war to direct the invasion of France in June of 1944. And as Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, Eisenhower would lead the coalition to victory over Germany in May 1945. During those very difficult, intense, strenuous 3 years from 1942 to 45, Eisenhower evolved from a talented staff officer into a supreme commander. In the crucible of war, he discovered what he was good at. He also discovered what he wasn't so good at, and this was part of what made him so seasoned when he got to the White House. He learned to handle failure. He learned to handle disagreements with powerful men with big egos. Here are 4 of his egos that he had to tangle with on a regular basis. Those of you familiar with the history of the Second World War will recognize their names. We'll talk more about them. He learned to work with allies, even through tough times, and he'd lead them toward common goals. And he learned to make decisions, as Mike reminded us. He learned to make decisions that he knew would send men to their deaths. But these lessons came at a steep price, and I want to talk a little bit about those 3 years and what he learned commanding in the Second World War. Eisenhower's first command experience was not crowned with glory. In November 1942, he directed the torch landings in North Africa. This was an operation that he did not like, nor did his superior, General Marshall. It was a plan that President Roosevelt insisted upon undertaking because the British wanted it. And it's important to remind ourselves, I always have to remind my students of this because they think the United States basically won the Second World War by itself single-handedly. But at this stage of the war, the United States was the junior partner in the great Allied coalition to the British. The invasion plan, though certainly ambitious, it was the largest amphibious invasion yet undertaken in the war, was nonetheless strategically and politically flawed. It was put together rapidly with little intelligence of local conditions or politics, The landings would take place in Morocco and in Algeria, but they didn't reach as far as Tunisia and Tunis, the gateway to Italy, a huge mistake for which the Allies would pay with thousands of lives and months of hard fighting. As soon as the Allies landed in Algeria, the Germans jumped into action, flying Luftwaffe units and 35,000 frontline troops to Tunisia, including the 10th Panzer Division. As the Allies slowly moved towards Tunis, the Germans set out a ring of defenses that would in the end take 6 months of bitter fighting for the Allies to penetrate. But just as bad as the strategic misjudgment in North Africa was the political mess that Eisenhower created by rapidly coming to an agreement, an understanding with a distasteful political figure named Admiral Jean-Louis Darlan. He's depicted here on the left, but also on the right. This is Goering, the Vichy collaborator leader, Marshal Pétain in the center, and that's Darlan on the left. Darlan was an opportunist. He was an active pro-German collaborator who had served as Prime Minister of Vichy France, working for Marshal Pétain. And he just happened to be in Algiers during the torch landings. Well, Darlan, who was an unscrupulous grifter, immediately switched sides. And he approached Eisenhower, and he basically said, I'm coming over to your side provided you will back my authority here in North Africa. I'll be your man in North Africa. He was leaving Vichy behind, rallying to the Allied side. Eisenhower accepted the deal, the Darlan deal, only to find that in London and in Washington, whose superiors were aghast at this bad political judgment. Darlan was a notorious Vichy criminal, basically, whitewashing his past as a military expedient, made a joke out of the high-minded ideals for which the Americans were fighting. Eisenhower was publicly chastised by both Churchill and Roosevelt for this, and was saved from this self-inflicted mistake only because Darlan was assassinated in December 1942, just a month later. So, phew, dodged a bullet. And indeed, speaking of dodging a bullet, Darlan did not dodge the bullet. We still don't know who assassinated him. There is speculation that maybe the OSS was involved in some way. Others speculate that it was the French, Gaullists, but we still don't know the answer. Anyhow, the point is the invasion of North Africa was marred by poor pre-invasion planning, poor U.S. fighting abilities, poor inter-allied cooperation, and poor political judgment. All of these weaknesses became painfully obvious in February 1943 when the Germans humiliated the Americans at Kasserine Pass. In due course, the great American advantage of supply and materiel began to tell. Slowly, with great cost and effort, the Anglo-American forces strangled the Germans and pushed them out of North Africa. But the invasion of French North Africa had taken 6 months instead of 6 weeks. So Eisenhower's superiors, Roosevelt, Churchill, General Marshall, Field Marshal Allenbrook, they came to see that Eisenhower was perhaps not ideal as a battle commander, but they understood that he possessed personal qualities. They could already see the personal qualities that no other commander had. An ability to conciliate, to promote inter-allied cooperation, to inspire confidence of those who worked for him. He was superb at handling the press. He had become a favorite of the media, and his extraordinary face with that absolutely just iconic smile was already widely known across the United States. He was a natural leader, even if as a military strategist he sometimes appeared at this stage in the war to be a little bit lacking. As the North African campaign wound down, General Marshall chose to elevate Eisenhower, giving him a 4th star while placing the actual fighting in the hands of 3 British, the Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, and General Sir Harold Alexander. So Ike was kicked upstairs, basically. And a lesser man might have bristled at this. Eisenhower instead embraced the role of chairman of the board, and he delegated responsibility to his battle commanders. He trusted them, and in turn they gave him their loyalty. He learned a lesson that stood him in good stead in his political career. Success in war, as in politics, requires strong relationships. It requires trust and loyalty and shared sacrifice. And his subordinates came to admire these qualities of tact and fairness and trust. Let me just give you just a sprinkling of what the British who worked for him said about him. General Hastings Ismay later said, "The only man who could have made things work was Ike. And by things, we mean the Anglo-American coalition. He was utterly fair, said General Alexander. Harold Macmillan, Churchill's representative in North Africa, called Ike, quote, a jewel of broad-mindedness and wisdom. So here was a curious thing, and this is actually related to his later political success. People around Eisenhower fell in love with him, even when they saw his shortcomings, in this case as a military commander or warfighter. And indeed, during the invasion of Italy that followed the North African campaign, Allied forces made some of the same strategic mistakes. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 sent 13 divisions onto the island only to encounter well-defended German positions that held them up for a month. Worse, the entire German force in Sicily launched a brilliant evacuation, withdrawing 100,000 German and Italian troops right under the noses of the Allied forces. Eisenhower had made no plan to cut off the German line of retreat across the Straits of Messina, which is a pretty shocking failure. In September of 1943, Anglo-American forces jumped onto the mainland of Italy, only to find the Germans planning a long, drawn-out fighting retreat in countryside ideally suited to the defense. So for 18 months, the Americans and the British ground their way up the boot of Italy in what the Americans felt, and Eisenhower really felt, was a sideshow of the war, a campaign that was marking time until the invasion of France could be undertaken. So here's the larger point. The Allied progress against the Germans in 1942 and 1943 was slow, it was full of blunders, a steep learning curve, it was costly, and frankly, it was less strategically significant than anything that the Russians were doing on the Eastern Front. That doesn't make Eisenhower a bad commander. It reminds us of the arc of the history of the war. From 1942 until early 1944, General Eisenhower was forced to live in a strategic context not of his own making. For the first 2 years of the war, the United States forces were not capable of waging the kind of war its generals preferred. The American way of war called for the application of overwhelming force against the enemy's strong point. But in Europe in 1942 and 1943, the U.S. forces could not yet apply that doctrine. Until they could win the Battle of the Atlantic, they couldn't get sufficient forces, troops, and supplies across the ocean. They didn't yet have control of the air to protect the amphibious landings. And they struggled to beat the Germans in face-to-face combat because their troops were still very green. And German skill and superior armament tended to win out. So the U.S. needed 2 years to gear up its war machine and bring it to bear on the enemy. So Eisenhower's 2 years in North Africa and Italy taught him that the British way of war, the indirect approach, the search for the soft underbelly, the dispersion of forces, this gradual whittling away at the enemy while the Russians were actually doing most of the killing, that was a recipe for stalemate and possibly worse, even defeat. It was not until January 1944 that Eisenhower, General Marshall, and President Roosevelt were able to impose an American design upon the war. Following the Tehran Conference, at which Stalin all but mocked the Anglo-American war effort in Europe and demanded a serious second front, Roosevelt named Eisenhower to command Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France. From January 1944 on, Eisenhower spent all his time and his considerable skill in planning for the greatest operation of the war. So that's just to stress that, of course, had Eisenhower been an absolute genius of a battle commander, he still would have been fighting at a disadvantage because of the state of the American military between 42 and 44. But now Eisenhower's real talents began to tell from January 44 on. The task that he faced as to plan and to command Overlord was truly staggering, and it's almost, we're so familiar with the story of D-Day that it almost appears as if just sort of magically out of nowhere came this gigantic armada of soldiers and ships to land on the beaches of France. Nothing could be further from the truth. The enormous difficulty is staggering once you look into it. The Supreme Commander had to train and equip an invasion force of 1 million men procure 5,000 ships to carry these men and their supplies across 20 miles of heavily mined, swirling English Channel, land these soldiers on expertly defended beaches, engage and defeat the enemy, and keep the entire operation secret, mind you, until the day of the invasion. In order to have any hope of success, Eisenhower had to achieve a number of very significant preconditions, namely, sweep the German Navy and U-boats out of the English Channel, win Allied superiority of the air by engaging and defeating the Luftwaffe, undertake a massive bombing campaign using precious aircraft of France's rail and road networks so the Germans could not reinforce Normandy once the invasion had begun. Add onto these tasks the need for a gigantic deception effort, fortitude, designed to create the impression in the German mind that the actual invasion was going to come in the Pas-de-Calais further up the coast than in Normandy. Wow, think about solving all those problems in 6 months. But it was in solving the endless logistical, supply, and coordination problems that this vast invasion required that Eisenhower showed his true mettle. Overlord would be a very different kind of battle than in North Africa or Italy. Eisenhower imposed an American plan on the British, who until the very last minute were quite wobbly about Overlord. He insisted the operation be one of massive, overwhelming force, that it be conducted only after air and naval supremacy had been established, that the best possible intelligence be gathered, that plans be drawn up for supplying the forces once they had landed, that the Germans be weakened and hampered beforehand by a massive bombing campaign, and that naval, air, and ground forces be fully coordinated and integrated. All these tasks would have been difficult under the best of circumstances, but Eisenhower faced the problem that his closest ally, the British, didn't like the plan and were constantly trying to undercut it. So this was no simple undertaking, yet Eisenhower prevailed. And he did it by conciliation at times, threats to resign at other times. Above all, he manipulated the thing that the Americans had now fully, which was overwhelming material power by this time in the war. By the time of D-Day, the U.S. was the senior partner in the alliance, and Eisenhower was able to use that leverage that created to get his way on a number of issues. Yet staying on good terms, good personal terms, with Churchill, Allenbrook, and Montgomery. In planning D-Day, Ike truly emerged as the supreme commander. And the execution of the landings, the June 6 landings in France, I think was Eisenhower's finest hour. It reflected the American doctrine of massive coordinated firepower against the enemy, even though there were plenty of setbacks in the fighting that followed after the June 6 landings. The huge advantage of firepower, the command of sea and the air, the astonishing abundance of supplies, all this soon began to wear down the enemy. By the end of August 1944, German resistance in Normandy broke and France would be liberated. Eisenhower would continue to wage the war against Germany, much to the annoyance of Montgomery and some of the British generals, in this same dogged, overwhelming way, using massive firepower, combined operations of air, sea, and ground forces, building up of massive supplies and troops, encircling and destroying enemy forces, and simply grinding down the Germans piece by piece, day by bloody day, until May 8, 1945, when Eisenhower took the German surrender. This is my favorite picture, I think, of Ike. It's taken just after the war. I think he was in Hawaii. This is a guy who's just won the Second World War. He's very confident. He has a look about him of, you want a piece of me? or we can just play cards and be friends. You decide. A man of total confidence and comfort in his own skin. But I really do want to stress what an extraordinary development this just in 3 years had occurred. Imagine accomplishing so much, learning so much in this brief period of 3 years. He had grown as a commander and as a leader. He found his stride as a figure who could genuinely inspire loyalty and affection from other powerful generals and political figures. He had the right blend of courage and dignity and humor and self-effacing authenticity, matched with superior skill at organizing large-scale, high-stakes victorious military campaigns. And crucially, Eisenhower had an air of luck and good fortune about him that was valuable not just as a leader in the army, but of course for a politician, that was pure magic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if Eisenhower had gone home to America in the summer of 1945, as he said he kind of wanted to do, and retired to a cabin and just gone fishing, maybe he would have come out to Montana and gone fishing for the rest of his life, we would still know about him and we would still venerate him as the great victorious commander of the Second World War. But of course, that's not what he did. Eisenhower had a second chapter to his life. I won't talk about the 8 years or so between the end of the war and the presidency, but if you want to come back to this in the Q&A, I'll be happy to do it. In 1953, Eisenhower was elected the 34th President of the United States. So my question tonight, and I'm now going to be able to shift to, is how did the Second World War, everything that he had learned as a Supreme Commander, how did it shape his leadership as President? And this is something that we might just think about in other contexts, because we often ask, does experience matter in the White House? And most of the time we say, damn right it does. Probably Eisenhower was the most experienced president to take office in the 20th century. George H.W. Bush might rival him for lifetime experience before becoming president, but they're at the very top of the list. So how did it, but the question is how? Well, give me some examples. So let me flesh this out a little bit. I think it had a significant impact on his leadership style, but also the way that he strategized during the Cold War. In certain kind of outward manners, the Eisenhower White House had a kind of military feel about it. Here's the Eisenhower Cabinet. The president appointed powerful people to his cabinet from industry, from the private sector, and then he delegated real responsibility to them, as he had done with his lieutenants in Europe. He used the National Security Council, as he had used Allied Force Headquarters and later SHAEF to run the war. In the NSC, his chief commanders from State Department, CIA, Treasury, the Joint Chiefs, all coordinated by the National Security Advisor, a title that Eisenhower created. General Bobby Cutler, the first National Security Advisor. They gathered every week for 2 or 3 hours to discuss global questions of strategy and policy. During the war, Eisenhower had used General Walter Beadle Smith as his chief of staff, basically his angry attack dog. And as president, he hired Governor Sherman Adams of New Hampshire as chief of staff, a man every bit as ornery and sour and vinegary as Smith was. Adams was known in Washington as the abominable no man because he said no to everything that anybody wanted from Eisenhower. But that's the kind of guy you had to have at the door, minding the door, who came in to see the president, who came in to see the Supreme Commander. Smith and Adams played a similar role. Eisenhower brought a disciplined order to the chaotic Truman White House and organized the week around key events. Every week, a press conference. Wait a minute, did you say every week the president held a press conference standing like this in front of the press? Yes, he did. And from 1955 onward, they were filmed so that they could be broadcast later on television. Every week, the president stood in front of the press for half an hour and took questions. I think we've fallen off a little bit from that tradition. But the point is, it became a weekly ritual. A weekly press conference, a weekly meeting with congressional leaders, a weekly meeting of the cabinet, and a weekly meeting of the National Security Council. Also, as he had done in London, Eisenhower loved to take a little recreation. In London, he had a little getaway house, Telegraph Cottage, where he lived with a kind of an army family, if you like, and he had a dog, and he even played some golf there. But at Camp David, he found a retreat for himself where he could go. He named it Camp David, of course, for his grandson. He played cards, he cooked steaks for friends, he went fishing and shooting. He also played frequently at Augusta National Golf Club in Georgia. All right, but these are rather superficial similarities. There's more to be said about the impact of the war on Eisenhower's presidency. And let me just mention 3 significant aspects. The first thing might surprise you. Eisenhower's experience in the war gave him the moral authority to speak out against war. Right from the moment the guns stopped firing in Europe, Eisenhower spoke with a passion and emotion about the terrible cost of war. On June 12, 1945, he traveled to London to receive an honor from the City of London. He gave an address at the London City Hall called the Guildhall when he was honored with this decoration from the London City. And he stressed in his Guildhall address that the war had taught him above all to be humble. He said, "Humility must be the portion of any man who receives acclaim earned in the blood of his followers and the sacrifices of his friends. Whatever honors a leader may earn," he said, quote, "they cannot hide in his memories the crosses marking the resting places of the dead. They cannot soothe the anguish of the widow or the orphan whose husband or father will never return." A week later, this is June 1945, Ike was back in New York, where he was welcomed with the biggest ticker tape parade up to that time yet held in New York. He received a huge welcome. He was hailed as a conqueror. But what kind of message did he give when he finally had a chance to speak? A message of peace. When he arrived at City Hall in New York, he gave a speech that again stressed the theme of the cost of war. Quote, one of my favorite lines from Eisenhower's speech, "There is no greater pacifist than the regular army officer," unquote. He went on, "Any man who is forced to turn his attention to the horrors of the battlefield, to the grotesque shapes that are left there for the burying squad, he doesn't want war. He never wants it. Peace is an absolute necessity to this world," he went on. As Americans faced the post-war period, Eisenhower said, "We should be strong, but we should be tolerant. We should be ready to defend our rights, but we should be considerate and recognize the rights of the other man." Here was a call for reconciliation, for understanding, for compromise, and a deep desire to avoid future conflicts. And those are themes that became keynotes of the Eisenhower presidency. So, the first way in which the war marked him was it made him into a man who would do anything to avoid sending more American soldiers to die overseas, if he could. At first, you think that's counterintuitive, but actually it seems perfectly logical given what he had to do and the lives that had to be expended to defeat Hitler. And yet Eisenhower did not turn into a peacenik overnight. My second observation about the impact of the war on Eisenhower's presidency relates to his grand strategy for waging the Cold War. Yes, Eisenhower frequently spoke out about the evils of war. But rather than disarm the United States in the pursuit of peace, he argued that the best way to avoid war was to prepare for it so vigorously as to deter any rival from challenging American power. So Eisenhower, as president from 1953 to 1961, embraced the idea of a permanent, peacetime warfare state. That was new in America. After World War I, the United States demobilized, had to rebuild the army all over again before World War II, and began to start doing the same thing after World War II until Korea. Eisenhower came in and said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to prepare for war so that we are ready at all times under any circumstances. He wanted the American military to be technologically dynamic and global, in a state of permanent readiness and overwhelmingly powerful. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the American way of war now transposed onto the waging of the Cold War. It was what he had learned in Normandy, what he had learned in Germany, would now be knitted into the fabric of America's Cold War policy. To wage the Cold War effectively, to deter the Soviet Union from an attack on the Americans or its allies, Eisenhower transformed the United States into a military colossus of the kind that had never been seen before on Earth, quite literally. In the 1950s, the United States nuclear arsenal grew from a few hundred weapons to well over 20,000 warheads that could be delivered on long-range B-52 bombers or Atlas and Titan ICBMs, as well as the submarine Polaris missile. By the time Eisenhower left office, the United States had detailed plans for launching 3,200 nuclear weapons at some 1,000 targets in the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe, all targeted, all ready to go at the order of the president. By the end of the 1950s, the United States had even taken the first steps in the militarization of space by getting the Corona spy satellite up into orbit. So in the Eisenhower years, the United States spent about 10% of its GDP, 10% of its GDP a year on the military establishment, a higher percentage than any peacetime administration before or since. Today it's about 3.3%. So the man who warned later generations so famously about the military-industrial complex was, of course, its principal architect. Eisenhower also wanted to avoid the kind of small, indirect wars that Britain, both as a colonial power and as an ally in World War II, had tended to wage. He ended active hostilities in Korea in 1953 by accepting an armistice there. The Korean War was a bloody stalemate. He viewed it as geopolitically, the point had been made. America would stand ready to defend South Korea, but it wasn't going to keep on shoving American boys into the meat grinder to do it. It could cut a deal and get half a loaf. Eisenhower made that deal in a second, much better than seeing young boys die in a war that he felt could not be won fully, but could be brought to an unsatisfactory conclusion. He avoided U.S. military intervention in Indochina in 1954. Absolutely crucial decision that Eisenhower made in 1954. Even though France was America's close ally and they were fighting the communists in Asia. They begged America to send troops in 1954 because they were about to lose that conflict in Indochina. Eisenhower said, no, that's the wrong war, in the wrong place, for the wrong reasons. We're not going to join a colonial country in fighting a colonial war in a faraway place in Southeast Asia. And they were especially not going to do it by sending in a little dribble of Marines. So he said no. He left his French ally out in the cold. The French lost that war, and Vietnam, of course, would be partitioned. Another case, the Suez Crisis, reveals a similar pattern of avoiding these brush fire wars. In 1956, Britain and France, angered by Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal, undertook an invasion of Egypt and kept their plans secret from the United States. Eisenhower was furious to have been lied to by his ally, British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, and afraid that the invasion of Egypt by Britain and France and Israel might bring in the Soviets and lead to a third world war. Eisenhower did what he had done in the months before D-Day. He imposed American control over the alliance. He said, no, we're not going to do that. You're not going to get away with this. He used American power, especially financial pressure and the threat of the leverage of oil reserves that America could supply to Britain because of the cutoff of oil through the Suez Canal. He used that leverage to demand an immediate British withdrawal from Egypt. Unable to resist heavy U.S. pressure, the British did indeed withdraw in the middle of the Suez operation. Eden was forced to resign. His career shattered. His health shattered as well. In this case, Eisenhower revealed that while he preferred to be known as a conciliator and a diplomat, he was also determined that the Western alliance in the Cold War would be led by the United States along a strategy defined in Washington. There would be no wars that could risk leading to a third world war like this that would draw the United States in as far as Eisenhower was concerned. So this is a fascinating result of the experiences and the lessons that he'd learned from the Second World War. So a frosty, anxious peace prevailed in the 1950s, created by U.S. power and nuclear deterrence, and maintained by a president who refused to squander American resources and lives overseas in the kind of small, forever wars that have come to characterize the post-1945 or maybe post-1989 period. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, the third example that I want to give you of the ways in which the Second World War experience impacted his presidency relates to another part of Eisenhower's strategy for waging the Cold War without starting a global conflict, namely covert operations. During World War II, Eisenhower relied upon secret operations, sabotage, resistance organizations to assist the U.S. war effort. Both the British and Americans encouraged resistance forces and partisan activity. This is a somewhat humorous example of partisan activity, but you get my point. The British and the Americans encouraged resistance forces and partisan activity against the Germans in Europe. And they went to great lengths to supply underground forces with arms and with information. Churchill, remember, had wanted to set Europe ablaze by using unconventional and asymmetrical warfare. And of course, the Allied war effort was immeasurably aided by the great intelligence breakthroughs of the war, especially the ability to read the encrypted German and Japanese signals traffic. The cracking of the Enigma machine and the resulting ultra-intelligence proved to be crucial in winning the Battle of the Atlantic, and perhaps shortening the war. So as president, Eisenhower was a natural champion of covert operations and intelligence gathering, for example, in the Corona spy satellite or the U-2 aircraft. For this reason, Eisenhower wanted a robust and active Central Intelligence Agency to assist America's efforts in the Cold War. Unfortunately, this deployment of covert and secret wars would, I think, lead Eisenhower into some of the most controversial mistakes of his presidency. With Eisenhower's approval and support, the chief of the Central Intelligence Agency, Allen Dulles, presided over a significant expansion of America's secret intelligence agencies and ordered them to conduct covert operations and coups d'etat around the world. We now have reason to doubt the wisdom of these actions. Dulles proposed and Eisenhower approved of U.S.-led coups in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954 against democratically elected governments. Those governments were tainted in American eyes because they seemed a little too friendly with local left-wing and Communist Party activists. These actions were followed by massive investments of secret aid to South Vietnam after the partition of 1954 to assist the brutal dictatorship of Ngo Dinh Diem on the top right there. In 1957, the U.S. began to channel significant military and secret aid to the rebels trying to overthrow Indonesia, President Sukarno, depicted here in the bottom left. In 1960, the U.S. began to plan for the overthrow of Fidel Castro in Cuba because he appeared in many American eyes as a communist radical who would infect the rest of the Caribbean. And in the same year, the CIA plotted to assassinate the leftist prime minister in the newly independent Congo, Patrice Lumumba, here on the bottom center. Eisenhower was deeply and personally involved in all of these operations. There is no ambiguity about that. We know this because the documentary record is so robust and so detailed, and one can follow with extraordinary care and accuracy Eisenhower's role in planning, shaping, pressuring, asking questions, debating, sometimes hastening, sometimes slowing down these covert operations. We can't blame Allen Dulles only. We have to understand the commander-in-chief was fully knowledgeable about these kinds of plans. But here's my point. This kind of activity seemed perfectly legitimate to Eisenhower and his aides. They had just come out of World War II, when it was always clear who America's enemies were. It was Nazism and fascism and Japanese imperialism. And during the Cold War, Eisenhower carried that same black and white view of who America's enemies were into the White House. He did see global communism, the Soviet Union, as just as bad as the Nazis in many respects. Now, we can debate that point of view, but that was a common perception of the early 1950s. In his first inaugural speech in 1953, Eisenhower told the American public that they faced a very, very dangerous enemy in the Soviet Union. Forces of good and evil, he said, are massed and opposed as rarely before in history. He said this about the US-Soviet rivalry in the Cold War. This is Eisenhower, who's just defeated the Nazi war machine. Forces of good and evil are massed and opposed as rarely before in history. He was clearly trying to raise the stakes of the Cold War to make them match the war that Americans had just led and been victorious in. Freedom is pitted against slavery. That's the word he used to describe communism. Freedom is pitted against slavery, lightness against the dark. He's raising the stakes to alert Americans to the crisis of Soviet global communism. He insisted the Soviet Union was a global threat to American interests, and the Cold War had to be waged with the same intensity as the Second World War had been waged. But a black and white view of the world made it difficult to know what to do with figures like this. Mostly third world nationalists who are more concerned with independence for their countries than with truckling under to Moscow. The truth is that Ike's simple us versus them worldview that had served him very well in the Second World War was not especially well adapted to the problems of nationalism in the post-war world. Eisenhower and his advisors tended to fall back on the simplistic notion that any nation that was critical of America and sought neutrality in the Cold War, non-alignment, was probably a threat to U.S. global interests. And this led to an aggressive use of covert operations that caused political upheaval, considerable human suffering, and I think in the long run, most historians would agree, did more harm than good to U.S. interests. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've given you three big things to think about, three ways that Ike's war experience shaped his presidency. It made him hate war and its corresponding loss of life. It made him determined to build a powerful nuclear arsenal to deter future conflicts. And perhaps it made him too reliant upon secret covert operations to confront the challenge of third world nationalism in the 1950s. So a mixed legacy. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States was extraordinarily fortunate to have leaders of the quality of Franklin Roosevelt, George Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower to lead the country during the terrible years of World War II. In a short period of time, such a short period of time when you think about it, they mobilized the nation to defeat fascism in Europe and Japanese imperialism in Asia. They laid the foundations for a post-war order that has brought greater, widening freedoms and economic growth around the world ever since the end of the Second World War. They were not perfect, and I have discussed a few of Ike's imperfections here tonight. But the war certainly shaped Eisenhower's worldview and indeed the generation of people who passed through the war. One thing I have the feeling that Eisenhower took away from his war experience is the notion that democracy is actually fragile and that there are times when you have to fight for it. Self-government requires work. It requires sacrifice. It requires selflessness and devotion to country. And to lead a democracy requires dignity. It requires honesty, humility. I think Dwight Eisenhower possessed those characteristics. And I will gladly leave it to you to decide if Eisenhower's successors have done as well. Thank you very much for your time. Love to have your questions. I see a microphone there. Is that it to be used, or do you want to just raise your hand and we'll go from there, if I can hear you? I think maybe the mic if you have a question. Come on, yeah, give it a shot. No one's gonna bite you.
I was going to ask you, what's your opinion on how Ike's lack of combat experience, like how that put in perspective from other military leaders? Like, how did they view that for him to have such grand military power with his lack of combat experience?
It was seen as a fault. And there were a number of his generals, both American and British, who viewed his lack of combat experience in the First World War, or indeed in the early stages of the Second World War, that is to say, combat on the ground, as a detriment. I mean, to summarize it, Montgomery, his British nemesis, said about Eisenhower 4 words: "Nice chap, no general." The Montgomery-Eisenhower story, of course, is a very rich one. They really didn't get along. Eisenhower respected Montgomery's fighting qualities, and Montgomery really did have very significant fighting qualities, a very successful cavalry tank commander in North Africa. And indeed, he had grip, he had toughness, he had resilience, he had doggedness. But he thought he was smarter than Eisenhower, and he resented Eisenhower's power over him. And he constantly was proposing alternative strategies that Eisenhower had to generously squash. But the fact that he did not have World War I experience was sometimes seen as a negative, that he was often, even in the press, he was sometimes referred to as a hotel general, somebody who stayed behind, which is, you know, terribly unfair, somebody who stayed too far behind the lines. But I think my point about depicting his learning by experience is that he grew in the job. And after all, it isn't just gut and determination that leads to victory. It's organization, it's planning, it's vision, it's cooperation, all of those interpersonal skills that Eisenhower had in such large quantities. So they forgave him for his lack of combat experience. Thanks. Good question. Sorry to make you have to come all the way around. We ought to be passing the mic, but if you get, oh, there is one. Oh, good. Oh, excellent. Yeah, great.
You've talked about how Eisenhower's World War II experience affected his foreign relations, his military agenda. How did it affect his other aspects of his policy and presidency, like more on the domestic front?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll give you the example that comes to mind, I think, where I think I can make the strongest case for a direct connection is Little Rock. Little Rock is a case where Eisenhower was challenged. His role as Supreme Commander, in a sense, was challenged by the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, who said, look, if we don't want to implement Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision of 1954 here in Little Rock, we don't have to. It's a states' rights thing. And by the way, you know, I'm here. I'm on the ground. I'm trying to keep law and order here. And there's an unruly mob at this school, and we're going to tell everybody to go home. And I know Brown versus Board is some Supreme Court decision, but really, states' rights first. And Eisenhower didn't simply waffle. He didn't say, well, golly, what should I do here? I don't know. Maybe he's right. Maybe states' rights should triumph over federal law, etc. He applied, in a sense, you could argue, the American way of war, which is to deal with a difficult governor in Arkansas with overwhelming force. So he did invite Orville Faubus to come to meet him. He was in Newport, actually, playing golf, naturally. And he basically proposed, look, you're going to lose this thing. You got to back down right now, and then we're going to be friends, and nothing bad, you're not going to lose too much face. Faubus said, well, yeah, I guess that's probably a good idea, maybe I should do that. And he went back to Arkansas and said, nope, you know, obviously he never backed down. And that's when Eisenhower decided to send in the airborne and to federalize the Arkansas National Guard. So what he basically did was to say, I'm not just going to show you that I could threaten you with federal action, I'm actually going to do it. I'm going to resolve this case in the most visible, most overwhelming manner to demonstrate federal superiority, federal suzerainty in this case, over the states that we're trying to monkey with the implementation of Brown versus Board. Now, what's frustrating to historians of civil rights is they say, but why didn't he say that at the time? What he did say was, this is a question of law, the rule of law, imposing the rule of law. It's not a question of the morality of the civil rights movement. So he waffled on the moral question while putting all of his chips into the question of authority, power of the federal government to impose the law of the land on the states. So it's just one example, but I think it was a classic case of where Ike wanted to use all the power that he had so that he could cut off any possible copycat actions by other Southerners. You know, after Brown versus Board, as you know, 1955, 1956, there's massive resistance to the Brown versus Board desegregation decision all across the South. In state assemblies and in school boards. My home city of Charlottesville closed the public schools in 1956 rather than integrate them. They closed the public school systems and they built private schools instead. So they refused to integrate. And this was a problem that was burgeoning all across the South in the late 50s. And Eisenhower took advantage of this one case to say, it has to stop. We have to demonstrate that we're going to impose the law. Was it effective? No, it was very effective in Little Rock, but nationally, of course, the desegregation of public schools across the South was extraordinarily slow and was dragged out for years afterwards.
Could you tell us what's happening with the Washington Memorial in Washington, D.C. that's under construction?
I'd be
and
delighted
some of the conflict about that?
Yeah, there was so maybe some of you all know this story about the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington. It's a good story, and it's going to be inaugurated on May 8, the VE Day, 2020, the ribbon cutting. So it is underway, and it will happen on May 8, 2020, this coming spring. There's a significant parcel of land right near the Air and Space Museum, the transportation building, if you know Washington. It's kind of an awkward little patch, but it's not small. It's a significant rectangle of space, just about a couple of blocks south of the main Washington Mall. For some years ago, a competition was held, and oddly enough, the architect Frank Gehry was selected to design the memorial. Now, I don't know if you all are familiar with his work. Some of you will recognize it if you saw it, the Bilbao, music hall, these wonderful shapes of kind of bendy steel that he's known for, these extraordinary buildings. Well, frankly, is the least appropriate architect to sort of identify Eisenhower's utterly square sort of personality. So I don't know why they picked him, but he is certainly one of the most famous architects. But anyway, he designed the memorial, and it was kind of a mess. And the family, the other architectural review boards put the brakes on it, and there was a controversy that went on for quite a long time. It went on for so long that Congress threatened to cut off money because they were not making any progress on this thing. But they made changes in the portrayal of Eisenhower's life story. It's a curious memorial. There are about 6 or 8 enormous tall pillars, and those pillars are used to hold these metal screens, kind of slightly see-through metal fabric screens that are about 60 feet high, on which are printed images of Eisenhower's biography. At least that was the original idea. Now it's landscape of Kansas, kind of faintly on the background of these metal screens. And then there was a little statue of a little barefoot boy with a fishing rod over his shoulder. You know, this is the poor country boy looking at the future president and supreme commander. There's a lot of goofy stuff that was going on in this thing. And they brought some organization to it. They began to focus it really on 2 substantial memorials. One showing Eisenhower as supreme commander, actually in that picture of the day before D-Day. The other, interestingly enough, signing the 1957 Civil Rights Act. So they show him in 2 different settings, as a military leader and as a president. And those will be the principal focus of the monument. And it's going to be opened in May, and I'm going to be on a panel with other historians talking about the change in Eisenhower's reputation over the last 20 or 30 years, which has gone from being a very sort of an afterthought president to becoming one of the top 5 presidents in the sort of national rankings as these things go. So Eisenhower's story has dramatically increased, or rather his reputation has dramatically increased. I think that has a little bit to do with the people who've come since. There's been, in the sense that people are polarized one way or the other. As you go back further, Eisenhower becomes one of the few that most people will rally towards wherever they are today on the political spectrum. He's a person who, at least in our public memory, kind of defies political pigeonholing, and that may be one reason why he's increasingly popular in our polarized times. Thanks. Good question. Come to Washington and check it out.
You said that you would talk about 1945 to 1953 if we asked during Q&A. So getting from a general to a civilian to a president in 8 years, can you talk about that some?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to. I mean, it's an amazing story. He gets out of he becomes chief of staff of the army, which he hates. It's the top job. He's taking over for his idol, Marshall, but he has to dismantle the American military that he'd done so much to build. So it's a very difficult job, and the soldiers want to come home and they want to be demobilized. It's not the exciting thing of running a war that Marshall had. So he hates that job. He's looking for something to do. He's not quite sure what to do. He's still relatively young, 55. And he thought maybe, it might be nice to retire to some small college town and run a college. I could be a college president. How hard can that be? There's got to be some college around that'll take me. It's a lot harder than you think. And indeed, it wasn't just a college, but a university that came calling. Thomas Watson of IBM, who was the head of the trustees of Columbia University, invited Ike to become president of Columbia. So in 1948, Eisenhower was sworn in as president of Columbia University. That was going to be his thing. He was going to become great university president. He thought, this is going to be fabulous. I'm going to be surrounded by these smart people and these students, and I'm going to raise huge sums of money because I'm Eisenhower, and we're going to just transform this kind of dumpy university up here where everything is broken. Columbia was in a real state at that time. And so he goes in with a lot of enthusiasm and immediately runs into, you get it, you can predict it, university bureaucracy. And nothing happens, he's hard to raise money. And it's hard to deal with the faculty. The faculty all look down their noses at him. It was said that you had to give, if you wanted to, this is the kind of snooty remark that they would make about him. They say, if you want to give General Eisenhower a memorandum, make sure that it's all on one page, or else his lips will get tired. They felt like they cast him as a dummy. The intellectuals immediately cast him as a dummy. And this is the beginning, by the way, of the notion that Eisenhower was somehow not very intelligent. And he never got rid of that criticism especially from the press. But I'm belaboring this, but Eisenhower used the Columbia presidency as a time to become a political figure. For the first time in 40 years, he didn't have a uniform on. And he was like, woohoo, I can say whatever I want. And he did. He went out on the hustings. He spoke 2 or 3 times a week to national audiences, not just in New York, but around the country. And what did he speak about? I've read all of the speeches. They were highly political. It turns out General Eisenhower was a conservative. He was critical of the New Deal. He was critical of what he called the dictatorship of the state, the growing size of the federal government that was suppressing individual liberty. The growing deficits. He actually was trying out a sort of stump speeches in 1949, 1950. Well, in 1950, the Korean War begins, and Eisenhower, the country's most popular, most famous general, is immediately brought back into service as an advisor initially to Truman, and then Truman asks Eisenhower to do something for the country, which is to become the first leader of the NATO alliance, to go to Paris and become the first Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. And Eisenhower puts his uniform back on, and he says, I'll go. It's my duty. So he goes to Paris in 1951. And I just want to say it was a crucial role because NATO was not popular. Well, you can't imagine such a thing, right? I mean, when would NATO ever not be popular? Well, but in 1950s, early 50s, it wasn't popular. We had just brought the boys home, for heaven's sakes. We can't be, and we're also involved in Korea. Now we're sending 5 divisions to Germany to what? This can't be right. Why don't they do it themselves? These were the things that, of course, the public was asking. Truman said, well, send Eisenhower to France, which is where the headquarters were. He will lead NATO for us. Eisenhower was extraordinarily effective as a spokesman for the alliance. He came back and he spoke to Congress and said, this is something we have to do. You have to approve it. And they did. He helped to persuade Congress to vote for and support sending troops back to Europe to prepare for what they thought might be a Soviet invasion. So again, his political stock just kept getting higher and higher. It seemed like there was nothing he couldn't do. And many of his close friends in business, in the press, quietly said to him, Ike, you're the only man that can save the world. If you don't run for president, Harry Truman will run again, because remember, he hadn't had 2 full terms. And we're going to have 25 years of democratic rule. And Eisenhower said, that's a problem. We don't have a 2-party system then. And he allowed himself to be talked into running for president in 1952, while he was still in uniform, by the way. He was still in Paris when he won the New Hampshire primary in 1952. Then he came back and resigned and ran for president and won in a landslide. So it's a story of a man discovering who he was politically, discovering what he wanted to be, and realizing that he still had a lot of runway ahead of him. He wasn't ready to retire and be a boring university president. Not that university presidents are boring. Yes, sir.
Yep. I'd suggest that the opinions of General Bernard Law Montgomery, of pretty much every adult in this room, were largely formed by the movie Patton in the early 1970s, which certainly dovetails with Eisenhower's dealings with him in 1943-45, which seemed to range from the annoyed to the contemptuous. But coming off a very long period of introspective on World War I, just finishing the centennial, knowing now that the British Army received a very tough graduate education in warfare and learned how to thrive, and then Montgomery emerged from this environment while Eisenhower spent World War I in Pennsylvania. Is the view we've been handed down justified of Montgomery?
That he was kind of a pompous ass? Yes, I mean, that was the view of the movie Patton, pretty much. Look, I mean, Montgomery, I think, was a complicated figure who was a successful battle commander, who his troops loved him. You have to give him that. He inspired fierce loyalty and devotion by many of his soldiers. He saw the back of Rommel out of North Africa. You have to hand him that. But he was a pompous ass, and he was very difficult as a person to deal with. And I think it was difficult enough for his subordinates, but it was very tricky for Eisenhower to boss him around, especially because he was the representative of the British commitment to the war commitment to the coalition. So I think Eisenhower had to handle him with a great deal of tact, and I think he did so. Whether or not our opinions of Montgomery are justified, I mean, I think by and large they are. Most military historians who have looked at the debate, if you will, between Montgomery's strategy for finishing the war in Germany versus Eisenhower's, many of you will know this. Eisenhower was arguing for what came to be called the broad front strategy, essentially flooding the zone with overwhelming force on a long front. It was going to be a long, slow, bloody war of attrition that would identify and essentially press one giant force north, one sort of south and east, surround the Ruhr pocket, and destroy the German armed forces. That was his objective, destroy the German military. Montgomery came along and said, and this is again reflecting the British way of war, we can finish the war much sooner, much cheaper. All we have to do is get to Berlin first, knock off the head of the beast. We can do this on a much narrower front, a pencil thrust, if you like, right for Berlin, and end the war quickly. It'll only take us 40 divisions. It'll be done in no time. Well, Eisenhower wasn't buying it, and he said, I don't see it. And most scholars agree that Eisenhower was right. It was a longer, slower war. It took more lives, perhaps. But Eisenhower's scheme, Montgomery's scheme, such as it was when it got tried out even in a small scale at Market Garden, was a complete disaster. So could you have won the war and defeated the German armed forces and decapitated the German military on the cheap with the British indirect way of war? I mean, I don't see it. So in that sense, I think Montgomery has lost the battle of memory and history. You know, the two of them kept writing each other letters after the war, arguing about all this. And in their memoirs, they continue to argue about it. So it's one of these stories that historians love to pore over, because they respected one another, but they also fundamentally disagreed about who was the better strategist. I think Ike gets it by a long shot.
Professor, can I stand and ask a question?
Yes, I can hear you now.
What impact did Ike's first big conflict, Suez, have on NATO and its formulation? Because you had primary members of NATO who were slapped back into line.
That's a great question. Suez, you would have thought, could have shattered NATO because France and Britain were humiliated in that conflict. But oddly, it had maybe the opposite effect, and the reason for that is that Eden, who, you remember Eden, Anthony Eden had worked in Churchill's shadow as foreign secretary for so long, since the 1930s. He'd been dying to get his chance to be prime minister. He'd been waiting forever. He had to sit and listen to Churchill's boring monologues all throughout the war. He was such a loyal soldier. He finally gets his, then after the war, oh no, Churchill still wants to be party leader. He's still prime minister in the 50s. Eden finally gets his chance in 1955, and he says, I'm going to have my great moment. That Nasser guy, he's just another Mussolini. He's just another Hitler. I'm going to get out the Churchill, rule book, and I'm going to go right in there and blast him out of there, and then I'm going to be the hero. All of that comes crashing down when Eisenhower pulls the chair out from under the whole operation. Eden was forced to resign. His successor was Harold Macmillan. Macmillan knew Eisenhower from the war, adored Eisenhower. They had very good personal relations. And instantly, and this is again part of Eisenhower's strength, but also his sense of public posturing, immediately embraced Macmillan, said, bygones be bygones, we have to stick together through thick and thin. I love England, you love the United States, we're going to be friends forever. So the reconciliation after Suez took about a week, in part because it was Macmillan rather than Eden. On the other side of the coin, the French, who you would think would be really ticked, and they were waging a conflict in Algeria. That's one of the reasons they wanted Nasser gone. I looked into this for a different project, but the French drew the lesson that they could never rely on Britain again. Now you'd think that would split NATO, but in fact what they did say, their political move was, now we're going to hasten our commitment to the European community. And in 1956, 1957, the French spearheaded a diplomatic offensive to tighten their links with Germany. They created a series of very important treaties with Germany that became the basis for the European community. So in a curious way, back doorway, the Suez Crisis actually brought the Western Alliance knitted it more strongly together. In part because they tested the limits of American power and found where the line was, I think. Eisenhower knew how to lead an alliance. I just think that's the fundamental takeaway here. Sometimes you have to use the carrot and the stick.
So one last question. How come we only have him as number 5 in our generation?
Okay, well, I mean, you got Washington first, and then you got to have a Lincoln, and the next two are that. And I say the next two. This is a recent poll, but it's pretty much all the polls of presidents when you do these things publicly. The next two are Franklin Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt. So that's a pretty high company. Maybe you could swap him out for Teddy Roosevelt. I don't know, but Teddy Roosevelt's a popular figure. But the fact is, Eisenhower, when the first poll of these was done after Eisenhower left office in the early 60s, out of 34 presidents that were listed on the rankings in 1962, a presidential poll was done. Out of 34, Eisenhower ranked 22nd. He was next to Chester A. Arthur, and you won't believe the other one, Andrew Johnson. Probably the worst president, right? That's how bad Eisenhower's reputation was amongst academics, scholars, the press, the kind of people who did those polls. It's mind-blowing, and ever since there's been a process of rediscovering his great talents, his strengths, his wisdom, his sort of sense of balance. We can criticize him for many things, and I do that a lot in the book, but I admire the equanimity, the ability to balance, the ability to see sort of the wider horizon. I think that's what the Second World War gave him, was a sense of don't panic, there's a larger picture here, there's a larger purpose here, we're going to lose some, but let's keep our eye on the prize. I think he was very good at that, and gosh, sometimes I think we all wonder, are we going to have that kind of leadership? Where will we find it again? I see Mike coming up here, so I have a feeling that that's the curtain. Thank you very much.
This production was made possible by a media grant provided to area nonprofits by MCAT, Missoula Community Access Television. For more information about MCAT, visit us at mcat.org. MCAT, Missoula's community media resource.